And lastly, at the end, before leaving, we will be asking for your feedback. So that's important for the faculty, for the lecturers, for future conferences, for us to know how you found the event. So I will put a link. You can click on the link, and it's an online feedback form. You should be able to fill it in quite quickly. So I'll remind you about that at the end of today and the end of tomorrow. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a nice conference.
Thank you, Gordana, and thank you so much to Gordana, who makes everything happen so smoothly and has put a lot of work into making this happen. So for our first speaker, I'm really pleased to be presenting Dr. Leona Gilbert, who is the brains and the energy behind TICKPLEX testing, TICKPLEX Basic and TICKPLEX Plus, are tests that a lot of us have been using, trying to help patients identify that they have Lyme, and very often convince that they're working with the NHS that they have Lyme too. So welcome, Leona.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm now going to share my screen. So I hope that you all can see this. Yes?
We're good, Leona.
Excellent. Excellent. I just make sure that I can see myself too. So yes, thank you for the opportunity of this. I thought it was really excellent that Monica actually gave me a challenge. She said, put into the perspective of the UK patients and make sense of comparing TICKPLEX with what is demanded in the UK. So that was really helpful for me. And I have some interesting notes to mention. I just want to say my disclosure statements. As Monica mentioned, I am one of the co-inventors of TICKPLEX. And because of TICKPLEX, we started this university spinoff company, Tezted. So we have been manufacturing and selling TICKPLEX all over the world for the last 5 years. Other than that, I have no other statements that will influence any of the points I mentioned in this presentation. And then hopefully we can move forward. 1 second. Yeah. No. All right. We'll try it this way. So the outline of my talk is basically broken down into some sections. First, we're going to discuss the need for better diagnostics in this world of tick-borne disease. I'm going to give you some UK perspectives. And I also want to have an appreciation of kind of the two main test parameters of Lyme disease diagnostics, that's sensitivity and specificity, and then discuss the need for multiplexing or multiple microbe testing, and then discuss the highlights of our recent paper that we published, because we have an intent to publish with many validation studies. And this one in the early year 2021 happened in Finland. So I wanted to go over some results with you.
Leona, can we try and reshare your presentation, because the screen is quite small right now?
Okay, 1 second.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
1 second. And can you see it now?
It's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So the only problem is going back and forth. Yes. So let's move on. So as you probably are aware that when the tick bites you, it can pass multiple microbes to you, causing multiple microbial infections, such as Lyme disease, neuroborreliosis, tick-borne encephalitis, relapsing fever, just to name a few. And this is the whole main kind of premise of the take-home message for today, is that when the tick bites an individual, there's multiple microbes that can be passed on to the individual. And this is what we have to address. So the occurrence of tick-borne diseases, believe it or not, in Europe is that every 120 seconds, someone is being diagnosed with a tick-borne disease. That statistics in the United States is every 96 seconds, and in China, it's every 2 seconds. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that's not true. Well, I'm going to give you some more statistics to actually put this in perspective, that these numbers are actually true. Patient advocacy groups in the United States actually have testified in court that it takes 11 different visits, 11 different doctors, 11 different tests, minimum 11 different years to get a proper diagnosis. And the governments are spending 20 billion euros to manage these patients. And with these problems, we need to address this big concern. And in addition, if you look at the yearly number of patients reported, you can appreciate that actually there are many countries in the world that don't even have a reporting system. And 5 years ago, we speculated that 2.8 billion people will be infected with a tick-borne disease by 2050, and our speculation was not unfounded. It has been recently published, actually 2.5 months ago, that number right now is at 1.2 billion people have seen Borrelia or have been infected with Borrelia. And these numbers are only going to increase because of climate change, because we are doing more things outdoors. And it also has been published that 2 million people are suffering from long consequence of tick-borne disease. That means 2 million people have post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, as published recently as well. And it's these numbers that we need to work on. And if we look at the UK perspective, of course, when one is looking at what is the reported cases in UK, you go to government pages. So this is what I've done. And it's interesting that they're saying that the cases of Lyme disease are not statutorily notified by practitioners, but they are notified when the microbiology lab has a positive result. And that's really interesting because this also excludes EM patients, so patients presenting with erythema migrans. And so if you look at really the accurate reported cases, it's far from, I believe, and others, from this 1,100 patients being reported every year in UK. And it's interesting because Carnes published in 2019 that the incident rate was 12.1 instead of an average of 2 that the government is reporting. And the highest incident rates are actually seen in Scotland, followed by South Wales and South England. And that this number could actually be more estimated to be 8,000 per year. And I hope these numbers seem more realistic than the 1,100, because I'm sure you are seeing many of these patients. But it's interesting for me that all EM patients are not notifiable. You do not have to report EM patients. So as we move on to understand what's going on in the UK and appreciate, what's going on in other countries. So you are most likely aware that the NICE guidelines dictates or gives guidelines on how to actually diagnose for Lyme disease. And it starts with a clinical presentation. So there has to be symptoms in the individual. And once they have symptoms, then of course, the practitioner makes a decision. Do they have an EM? If yes, then they can offer antibiotics and no testing is needed. But if they have symptoms and no EM, then they give the first hearing, the first line of testing, and it's usually an ELISA. But it's interesting, what's different with the NICE guidelines is they mandate that this ELISA, has to be an ELISA that has this VLSE or this C6 peptide. And I'm going to talk about this in a second. So they really mandate that the first tier have this type of ELISA-based testing. And if the ELISA-based testing is based on C6 ELISA is positive, then you have to do the second tier. And the second tier is to confirm with an immunoblot. But there is no demand on what type of an immunoblot or what the specificity or sensitivity of the immunoblot needs to follow. But this is kind of the two-tier system is recognized recognized all over the world, and many countries outside the United States is using this tiering system. But it's interesting, what I find encouraging is that they do state here, consider starting treatment while waiting for test results, and also do not rule out Lyme disease, even results are negative. And that's encouraging for me to know this. But what is mandated, having a first tiering of C6 peptide and the second tiering of immunoblot that's not defined, is actually a little discouraging. And I'll explain why I say those comments. So as we know with serology, it's not an exceptional disease for the healthy individual. Traditionally, in the early phase, early to localized infection, your IgM antibody goes up and then it will come down. And it usually takes a few weeks to get, high antibody levels of IgM. So testing within the first 2 weeks, as we know, is not very specific or sensitive. So let's not do that. And that's why they recommend, as I mentioned, if somebody is presenting with EM, not that NICE guidelines states do not test. And then, of course, what follows after IgM is IgG. And IgG will eventually come down to a little bit, well, a lot less levels than in the peak phase. But we also know, though, there have been studies, not a lot, but some studies that have indicated that some patients of post-treatment Lyme disease syndromes have persistent IgM or IgG. But that is the point to understand why these individuals have persistent IgM and IgG. These are individuals that have an immune system that isn't traditionally following this normal case of advancements of Lyme disease stages, because they are probably most likely suffering long-term consequence of Lyme disease. And it's interesting that right now the sensitivity of general tests worldwide is ranging from 54 to 90% for EM patients, urethral migrans patients, and then the sensitivity for Lyme neuroborreliosis, Lyme arthritis, or ACA is between 97 and 100% for patients. And it's interesting that to look at these two parameters, and we will look at them a little bit later, but most patients that are just newly infected with a healthy immune system should present like this. Those people that are not presenting like this, with the IgM coming up and going down and IgG coming up and going down, most likely are succumbing from an immune dysfunction, or that they have long-term consequences of tick-borne diseases. And to understand this, the two parameters that I've been talking about is that sensitivity of a diagnostic kit is really the proportion, okay? The statistical analysis of the proportion of people with the disease, okay, that have a positive blood test or positive test. And that means it can, if there's 100% sensitivity, that test will actually be able to correctly identify those individuals with the disease. But the specificity is the proportion of people without the disease, so they can accurately identify those healthy individuals. So sensitivity, obviously, when you're getting these parameters, you need clinically defined positive people that have been characterized elsewhere, that they have been positive, and then you compare the test against it and have a positive agreement between the two. But with specificity and a negative agreement, you need healthy controls, okay? You need that these individuals have been tested elsewhere by a reference test, and you compare it with the test of interest, and you see if there's a negative agreement. But I already gave you statistics, so generally speaking, the sensitivity, okay, for within any commercial test, or the 9 that have been outlined in this recent review, is ranging from 55% to 91%. And that's interesting. So that makes sense, kind of, because it takes a few weeks to develop antibodies for anybody that's newly infected. And then as we move along, I wanted to mention to you, which I found really exciting, that the NICE guideline demands that you carry out tests for Lyme disease only at laboratories that are accredited by UK Accreditation Service. So UCAS has to accredit these laboratories, okay? And in order to be accredited by UCAS, the clinical laboratory has to be accredited to the ISO 15189. So this is clinical laboratory ISO qualifications. And ISO 15189 is equivalent to the accreditation of UCAS. And I asked then UCAS, so what happens if I wanted to get a clinical lab here in Finland, okay, accredited under the UCAS demand, okay? And they said it's the equivalent. So if you have ISO 15189, or you're working with a clinical lab that has ISO 15189, and they are accredited by their national authority, so that would be FIMIA here in Finland, then you can get a letter from UCAS that states that this is equivalence. So for all those individuals, all those clinicians using tests from a lab that's accredited nationally in some other country that has the ISO 15189, then this is an equivalent to being UCAS accredited. And that was really exciting for me to find out this. In addition to this, the demand of NICE guidelines also states you need to use validated tests. So validation means, as NICE guidelines describes, should include published evidence on the test method, its relation to Lyme disease, and independent reports of performance. Well, this use of validated tests under this Medical and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency authority in UK, it demands that all tests actually have to be fulfilling ISO demands, and this demands for manufacturing is ISO 13485. And under that in vitro diagnostic kind of equivalence demand, if the test kit is CE IVD marked under the in vitro diagnostic regulation, which is actually needing a quality management system for manufacturing, and that's the ISO 13485, this would be equivalent on its demand on the definition of validation. So when you're choosing diagnostic kits from foreign labs, it is advisable to check to see if it's CE and IVD marked, if it's manufactured under the ISO 13485, because if it is, then it's equivalent to the demand that MHR has on test kits in UK. So equivalent. And then of course, the last demand that I noticed here that NICE guidelines had on diagnosing Lyme disease is that the clinical lab must participate in formal external quality assurance program. And I have to say that this demand is already in place for that clinical lab if they are accredited to the ISO 15189. So they're already doing it anyways. So going back to the NICE guidelines, when they say that you have to use a UKAS accredited lab, the equivalence is a national authority, okay, accrediting that lab in their own country that follows the 15189, and also then the demand of the test kit being validated thoroughly. Well, if it fulfills the IVDR, in vitro diagnostic regulations, manufactured under the ISO 13485, has CE or IVD marked on it, then it actually has the same demand and robustness as what the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency is. So again, what is the take-home message of these two slides is that anybody that can show equivalence, UKAS will give a letter that says that this is equivalent. And if these test kits can show the CE and IVD marked and it's manufactured under the ISO 13485, there is no way that any authority or any body, regulatory body, or any professional group that should actually reject any of these test kits or these labs performing those tests. And that's important to say. If you look and take these similar guidelines that they have in other countries like Australia or Canada, basically everybody's following the same kind of demand. That again, the clinical lab has to be minimum ISO 15189 accredited. They have to be nationally, have a national accreditation by their national body, and all the test kits have to have regulatory authority in compliance with it. And this is equivalent. So anything outside the NICE guidelines, if there's added validation that other people want, then that's totally different. Totally different than the governance of these test kits. So now I want to change to actually the VSLE C6 peptide. So the variable major protein, VMP-like sequence express, so this is the understanding of what VSLE is, a surface lipoprotein on the Borrelia that undergoes antigenic variations upon infection. There are two invariable domains, as you can see here on the N terminus and the C terminus of this protein. There are 6 variable domains, meaning that they can mutate. And then there's 6 invariable regions that has its central variable domains. And what we talk about the invariable region 6 or the C6 peptide in these test kits, you can see that this is the yellow dots here on the surface of the ball-like structure here, or in the ribbon structure, the yellow here. This main immunodominant is actually what is used in the first tiering of the NICE guidelines for the ELISA. And when I looked at the history of the test kits, looking at the VSLE full protein, commercial kits started coming out in 1999 under Steer and Wormser and other parties. And you can see that ever since then, a lot of these commercial kits that have been developed under famous names that we know. The C6 peptide similarly came out about the same year, 1999. And again, you can see the participants that are actually leading those commercial kits. The sensitivity of C6 commercial kits is 55 to 100%, and the specificity around 98. That seems reasonable for me at the moment, because you know the range already for EM is around 55%. So this wasn't unexpected. But if I looked at the patents that came out in 1996 and 1999 regarding specifically the C6 peptide, this was based on actually a few publications from Leong and Philip. And really, if you look at where the C6 peptide data comes from, that actually shot everybody so to become excited about this peptide being a very good peptide for diagnosis of Lyme disease. But in that exact study, you can see that the study demonstrated only in 2 strains of Borrelia, and actually not the 3rd strain that's actually prominent in this country, and as well in other European countries like Borrelia absolutely. So only 2 strains, they show that the C6 peptide is well conserved among the strains, okay? And based on that study, they're saying then this C6 peptide is well conserved amongst all the Borrelia species. And that's interesting because it's a little misleading that only 2 strains have shown this ball and ribbon-like structure that I showed you, and actually this where they are on the surface. So I want to make sure that we appreciate that the C6 peptides, yes, it has done so far so well, but there are limitations to this, and there may be reasons why these peptides have been pushed to be a part of demanded in the NICE guidelines in the first year. And I wanted to also appreciate that we're here not to how do I say, place doubt about these testing of this ELISA, but just to show that there are limitations to these diagnostic kits. So if we go back to why we're here on hand here, to appreciate the problems with tick-borne diseases, you may realize that when you're ordering test kits, that the commercial test kits are testing 1 antigen or 1 Borrelia species at a time, or 1 microbe at a time. And they're also testing 1 antibody at a time. So when the NICE guideline says that you have to test for IgG and IgM together, you need 2 tests basically. And patients are paying actually thousands of dollars out of pocket, even going, abroad to get proper testing, because they're not testing, for a multitude of things. They're only focusing on the Borrelia species. And so we decided to try to address these problems or these deficits in the testing scheme by developing TICKPLEX. TICKPLEX Plus tests up to 15 different microbes, and we test for IgG and IgM simultaneously on different spots. So you get a readout of actually how strong your antibody amounts are to the microbes. And also you get individual data to indicate which microbes you're suffering from. TICKPLEX Plus is CE and IVD marked. It is accredited under the medical manufacturing ISO, so the 13485. Okay, so we fulfill the NICE guidelines on this test kit. We also have filed patents on this, and we have maintained our ISO accreditation for the last 6 years, and we continue to maintain it. Now, our most recent clinical study that I want to talk about came out of collaboration here in Finland. So we approach Utenet Medics, one of the largest private diagnostic companies, to get involved and try to make sense of these summer flu patients. So this particular study was based on assessing the need for multiplexing, so multiple tests for multiple microbes of tick-borne diseases, okay, and use it in a routine clinical laboratory from samples that they collected over 2 years. Samples that were normally collected for Lyme disease testing, but also they separated the Lyme disease testing scheme and for for those people that are actually also suffering from a summer flu. And of course, because it's mandated in many kind of definitions, we also ask them if they have been bitten by a tick, or do they remember being bitten by a tick. So the aim of this study was, as I mentioned before, to assess the need for multiplexing, meaning to test for multiple microbes in this summer flu patients, and also to test the need of having IgG and IgM together and using it in a routine clinical lab. So when we do this, obviously we need to compare our reference tests, so tests that they use in a routine clinical setting, and test their results with our results from TICKPLEX Plus, and compare them with each other, and then compare it with scientific literature. So really we're assessing the need for a polymicrobial testing scheme and a polyfunctional testing scheme of testing IgG and IgM responses from a routine clinical laboratory. So what we did is we with Naturopaths, we collected 150 patients, all European patients, obviously, because they came from Finland. Okay, and basically they the clinical laboratory in Naturopaths decided to separate the Lyme disease patients. So we collected 48 of them. They also separated the Lyme disease negative patients, of course, and separated them so we know who they were. And then they collected 72 patients that had summer flu or febrile patients, so fevers, aches, and pains. And we actually learned from Naturopaths what they were using in their lab, and they were using diazorin, immunogenics, and microgens. And I'll tell you about these tests in a second, but basically they followed the two-tier system, where the first was an ELISA and the second was a Western blot when they tested for Lyme disease and Lyme negative patients. So the sample size and validation of the test kit, again, is outlined here. So we had Borrelia positive, which is group 1, Borrelia negative is group 2, and Borrelia fever or febrile patients were group 3. We conducted the testing of the samples in 5 days by one person at this company, and we used all the TICKPLEX Plus plates from one lot, so we controlled any intervariations between the lots. The scientific reference test that we use, the commercially available test that is basically the reference test, was the diazorin, Lyson, Borrelia IgM, and IgG test, the immunogenic C6 IgM, IgG, Lyme ELISA test, and the microgen recombinant beads tests. And we assessed the interpolymicrobial IgM and IgG responses from these tests with our index test, which is TICKPLEX. Now let's get an appreciation of the diazorin, Lyson, Borrelia IgM, and IgG test. The sensitivity of this test was determined on 141 serum samples, okay, from the German National Reference Center, and they got a sensitivity of anywhere from, well, you can see here 46 for IgM to 80 in EM patients, neuroborreliosis 43 to 93, or 25 in our 25 to 97. So depending on the IgG response. But if you take the two parameters together, and we're going to see this is a lot, you can see that the sensitivity of EM is 88. For neuroborreliosis patients is 97 around, and then it's 97 for Lyme arthritis patients. So there is some room for improvement, even if we put the two parameters of IgG and IgM together. But the specificity was 100% on 88 samples and 98% on 100 samples for IgM and IgG respectively. So not a bad reference test to start with. Then we use immunogenics test. And in this table, you can see Eurimmune's test alongside immunogenics test. And the one that's mandated by NICE guidelines is the immuno-C6 Lyme ELISA test. And for EM or acute patients, it's 76 sensitive, for 83 for convalescents. So moving from IgM to IgG antibody state, and then for late Lyme, it's 91%. So you can really see that there is really a need for improvement of these sensitivities of these tests. But then we look at the microgen recombinant bead Borrelia IgG test, okay, that we used here in our study. What's interesting is that they have multiple antigens associated with these beads. So they're coding, the antigens are coded on the beads, and it's set up in a reaction so that they put the antibodies, primary antibodies on, or the human sera on, and they incubate, and through watches will put a secondary antibody, just like the ELISA, and that secondary antibody has usually a fluorophore that can be seen in a spectrometry kind of testing scheme. These beads, interesting, the sensitivity, if you take a look at here, is, well, IgG is 100% they're claiming, and for Lyme arthritis, acrodermatitis 100%, neuroborreliosis is 87, EM, again, we see it at 55. But the IgM is not very good. For the IgM, for EM is 66%, for neuroborreliosis is 53, even less for ACA. And then, but if you put the two parameters together, though, it has improved the sensitivity of the test kits. So you will see a movement of moving from testing solely for IgM and solely for IgG to actually having a test kit that has the ability to give you parameters on IgG and IgM together. So this, putting the IgG and IgM parameters together, we can see we have a higher sensitivity in these microgen recombinant beads. And why I mentioned the last 3 slides is because these are our reference tests that we need to compare TICKPLEX. So TICKPLEX plate layout is like this. On one plate, we're able to test 3 patients. We test IgM on the first 4 rows and IgG on the last 4 rows. And you can see that we're testing the microbes from A1 to A10. But you also see on the plate, which is very unique, that we have positive and negative control like standard test kits do, but we also have a calibration control, C1, C2, C3. And these 5 controls are exceptionally a lot compared to what commercial kits are offering right now. But we wanted to have this just in case we have any fluctuations between labs, that they have different test results. We have strict requirements. So IgM and IgG positive controls, the OD values have to be, so optical density values have to be above 1.5. The negative controls have to be below 0.52. The inter and inter-day variation has to be less than 15%. And the R squared for the reproducibility of pipetting, and also to making sure that the plate controls are working, it has to be higher than 0.7. Now, these demands on the control for the plate dictates the intra and intraday plate control. And if they are below 15%, then we can say that the performer of the plate is doing as they should. If the R squared, as I mentioned, is higher than 0.75, as it is in both of the cases, we know that their pipetting is quite good as well. So we have these internal controls to make sure that not only is the plate performing, but the performer of the plate is actually within the range that they should be comparatively to other performers of the plate. So everything was fine with these plates. And then, of course, if we look at the overall performance of our reference tests, the 3 that we're comparing it to TICKPLEX by the instructions for use should dictate actually the sensitivity and specificity of each of these test kits. And we have aligned them up here. So Diazor and Liaison, again, for IgM and IgG, you can see that it's ranging from 30 to 93 for the sensitivity. Specificity is anywhere from 97 to 98. The C6 peptide, you can see 55 to 100, and then the specificity 98. The recombinant bead Borrelia IgG was 74 to 100 for IgG and 96 for the specificity, and TICKPLEX is 95 and 98 for sensitivity and specificity, respectively. So knowing and comparing that just before we start, we wanted to make sure that our plate is working and that we can start thinking about the performance of the test kit. Now, you may see here, that we have put the parameters together here, and same like the C6 peptide, we put the IgM and IgG together because actually we're not alone in doing this. There are Bio-Rad's laboratory patella Lyme IgM and IgG EIA has now decided to put these parameters together because they have actually increased the sensitivity and specificity data. And same with Euroimmunes, they have also put these parameters together. Because in a sense, knowing IgM and IgG, yes, it's nice to know that they're in acute phase and moving to dissemination phase, but the clinical outcome is still the same. They're positive, and the clinical treatment is basically the same as well. So combining these two parameters will just increase the robustness of the test kits, generally speaking. So when we're looking at us in this study, we use the two-tier system like NICE guidelines has dictated, but we need to compare our test with the test of the reference test. And in order to do this, we need to have an understanding of these terminologies. Positive agreement, which is when their test is positive and our test is positive, so it's in relation to sensitivity. Negative agreement, when their test is negative and our test is negative, so in relation to specificity. So we have to take out these parameters and analyze that. So for Borrelia positive group, we will test and compare the positive agreement. For the Borrelia negative group, of course, we comment on the negative agreement. But for Borrelia fever group, okay, or febrile group, we can assess the positive agreement and negative agreement. And remember, all SARAs have been tested with these reference tests. So if you look at this table here, what we're seeing is a comparison of Diasorin's test against C6 ELISA, Diasorin's test against the IgG blot, Diasorin's test against TICKPLEX. And you can see then what the positive agreement is compared to TICKPLEX on its own. Then if you go to immunogenics here, the C6 peptide compared to IgG blot, okay, we're going from 70% positive agreement to 75, negative agreement, overall agreement in 73, and Cohen's K analysis, Cohen's kappa analysis indicates the closer to one it has will actually indicate if this is a almost perfect agreement or not. So if we look at IgG blot, microgens, TICKPLEX, we have 53% positive agreement. We have 76 negative agreements, overall agreement in 68, and it's 0.29 in Cohen's kappa, which means that it has this is a fair agreement. But when you look at the two-tier system, so dictated by the NICE guidelines, and compare it to TICKPLEX, we have an 86 positive agreement, and we have an 88 negative agreement, okay? And then we have an overall agreement of 87 with a Cohen's kappa of 0.74. 0.74 is that these agreements to the two-tier system is substantial here. And this is interesting, this table, because it really shows that there is varying ranges of test kits compared to one another. And why this variation? Well, you can see actually, if you look at the index test compared to reference tests, and these are a lot of FDA approved tests as well, you can see that the positive agreements and negative agreements range from 56% to, let's say, 90 in the positive agreement, the negative agreement as low as 33 to 77. So really what this tells us is that these test kits are not agreeing with one another. You can use the same test in different labs and use a different test in the same lab, and there will be these disagreements, or there could be this good agreement, positive agreement. If we look at table 7 here, what we have done with the past study and other studies is that we took the TICKPLEX test and we compared it to the reference test. So we did a Latvian study where we used TICKPLEX Plus, and we used their routine lab test, the Siemens, and we got a 60% positive agreement, and for a negative agreement, we got 85%. Then with TICKPLEX was compared against the Finnish study that I just showed you. Our agreement is 81 to 88% positive agreement, and the negative agreement, depending on the test, is 70 to 84. But then we did a German study with a large sample size of 331. The German test kit that we were using was Euroimmunes ELISA, or the Borrelia IgM and IgG immunoblots. And we have a 95% positive agreement. And we also have then a 98% negative agreement. So what this says is that we're matching really well with your immunes, comparatively speaking, okay? And then we did a very small Netherlands study where we took 10 samples and we used the SaraSpot anti-Borrelia test kit, and we had 100% positive agreement and 100% negative agreement. What does this really mean? Why this variation? The variation is really because of the different Borrelia antigens that these test kits are using and what source of where these antigens are coming from. Is the test using peptides or purified proteins, or are they using whole cell lysates, okay, or recombinant antigens or recombinant proteins in their test? And because that always influence actually the positive agreements or the negative agreements within the studies. And then if you look at actually the needs, going back to why we did this study, to assess the multiplexing aspects. Do we need to test for multiple microbes, on the onset if somebody is presented with the summer flu or suspicion of, a tick bite? And this study from the patient sample, or from the finished patient samples, we had the Lyme disease samples here, and we have the febrile samples here. And this is a heat map of showing the co-occurrence, okay? The darker the shade of the yellow is, closer to blue, is the co-occurrence, the higher co-occurrence of actually a Lyme disease person suffering from Borrelia spiricets, and comparing them to other microbes that they could be suffering from. So take-home message in this is that these febrile or these summer flu individuals are not only suffering from Borrelia spiricets or even the persistent form of Borrelia, but they can be suffering from multiple microbes as well. And to show this in a bar graph here, you can take a look at the IgM response on the top panel and IgG response on the bottom panel. And if we only test for Borrelia, you can see that we do get a higher response of Lyme disease for Borrelia, of course, with febrile patients. Febrile patients are also having immune reaction, IgG immune reaction, some IgM reaction to Borrelia. But if you put Borrelia and the other microbes together, okay, and look at the statistics here, you will also see that actually these febrile patients on the onset are responding to the microbes and multiple microbes, not just Borrelia. And if you look at only these patients with other microbes and not the Borrelia, very little patients are actually suffering from those co-infections or that may be presented when Borrelia is not. So it's indicating that with these finished patient samples, they are suffering from mostly Borrelia and co-infections. So on the onset, it makes sense that they test for multiple microbes that are coming from the tick itself, and also maybe these opportunistic infections that they may be suffering from as well. And if you look at, well, all these results, there's lots of positive results, and is this specific or not, or is this random, or is this only in finished patients? Well, the IgM and IgG, so IgM response are outlooked here, where P is positive, N is negative, and BL is borderline. And by color coding the positives in red, you can see an overall kind of, the patients that are suffering from multiple microbes here out of the patient size that we have. And you can see that the IgM and IgG polymicrobial response is not by Sarah specimen. It's not really randomly widespread. It means that the polymicrobial response is prominently in patients that actually are suffering from Borrelia species here. And that 19% of our patients respond to Borrelia antigens and then other antigens, so co-infections. In some cases, we have these individuals popping up, and you may have seen this from reports if you have ordered TICKPLEX Plus before, that you will have some patients that are shining up on almost all of these individuals. And we have we are unique in seeing this pattern now, because we are testing multiple microbes here, and we're testing 2 antibodies, and we are seeing these universal patient people here. And this is a very good indication that these individuals has suffered long-term tick-borne diseases. And this is really saying something about their immune system and the fitness of it. So taking an outlook of, I don't know, if you have ordered like 10 of TICKPLEX and putting them together and recognizing that we could have these universal positive IgM individuals, like we have 2 patients here, and then IgG positive, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here. And this fits the percentage of the populations that we call these universal positives globally, actually. So we have investigated this phenomenon in Canada, in Mexico, in the United States, in Australia, and also in other European countries. And basically we see these individuals that are shunning up to any serology test. It's not just ours. And some of the reasons of this is also that they have immune complexes. So there's a standard kind of hypothesis that we're going to publish on that indicates that these individuals are developing immune complexes. So they have underlying autoimmune diseases, and they may even have a viral contributing factor to actually their state of their immune system. So this was really interesting to find this, because there's not very many tests, commercial tests out there that you can have a wide spread of kind of results like this to see, look at this fitness. And you'll notice that we have EBV, so Epstein-Barr virus, that are fitting the normal of the positives in the population. And that's really nice to see that this test kit fits that, the prevalence, global prevalence as well. Same with B19 virus. So our take-home message for this talk is that tick-borne disease is not just limited to Lyme disease. You probably know this as well, but it might be very interesting to make sure that they're in your testing scheme, that you're not just testing for Lyme disease, but you're also testing for other microbes for other diseases as well. So we suggest to screen for tick-borne diseases on the onset, so that you can get better kind of treatment outcomes for these individuals. So TICKPLEX Plus offers an increase in accuracy in the diagnosis of Lyme disease and also microbes associated with tick-borne disease. It has the ability to quickly and efficiently screen individuals against several microbes for multiple disease stages within 4 hours. So we're hoping that TICKPLEX can become the standard of care when we're actually dealing with anybody that has been bitten by a tick or has been bitten by a tick previously years ago and it still has symptoms and still is sick. So thank you. And my last slide is the references for I know it's small font, but you guys will get copies of these slides. So if you have any questions at the moment, I'm here to answer. So.
Well, while we're waiting for some of the questions to be put into the chat box, I would say thank you very much, Leona. That's been absolutely fascinating. And particularly that, because we have so many sort of GPs and healthcare professionals that say, well, they won't accept overseas results, from other labs. And to find that in actual fact, many of them do qualify. So one thing, I'm going to be picking your brains afterwards, it would actually be really interesting to put together a condensed guidance note, one side of A4, that we can actually give out to patients, doctors to say, actually, no, this does check on everything. Exactly.
And that's why I made these 2 slides here with the citations. And so it would be very easy for us to make that A4 kind of guidance document that you're talking about, because you can just copy paste from this area. And also I have this email confirming from UCAS that they will give a letter of equivalence, and to those labs that need it. So when talking to other clinical labs, I'm going to say, guys, go and ask them for your equivalence, documents, because you fulfill 15189 and you are nationally accredited. So
because sometimes patients spend a lot of money on tests and getting their blood overseas to get tested, and and then the doctor says, well, nothing, poof, not recognizing that at all.
I
So
know.
that's really, really great. Any thought on doing a comparison with the UK testing system?
Meaning getting UK samples? Yeah, I would love to. This is, I mean, this is the whole kind of point of, you know, trying to get into your markets. But I have to say honestly, and I will stop sharing screen so I can see your face. So because of Brexit, I have watched to see how UK came out with their guidelines on actually getting test kits into UK, and it is actually straightforward. They're following IVDR, so in vitro diagnostic regulation, which is a European consensus. Okay, so they are following that, but they have three demands, additional demands, and it's very easy to get a sponsor. So that's a demand to use UK UCAS CE mark on the test kits, so not CE but your own UK CE marking, and to register with the MHRA. So those are the three demands that we have to do in every country anyways. Okay, so it's nothing has changed actually. When Brexit happened, nothing changed really. It's just UK wants their own CE marking on its sponsor and register. So yeah, I would love to get samples. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
I muted you, Monica, because of sound, so you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
I was just going to say there's lots of questions coming in.
Okay.
Gordana, perhaps you could read them out so that Leona could answer.
Yes, so there is a question from Sebastian Pearson. If I have Lyme or co-infections, how effective is your test in diagnosis percentage-wise?
Yeah, so we go back to the parameters of sensitivity and specificity, because those are the two main parameters, and we are sensitive, 95% sensitive, and when specific, we're 98%. And this is actually out like performing of a lot of the test kits out there. Like I mentioned, C6 Lyme, Eliza, if you go to slide 27 of the handouts, I'm not sure if you have them already, but you can see the parameters there for the C6 Eliza. It's 55 to 100% sensitive. So there's a huge range. And then the specificity is 98%, which is the same as ours. So we're doing quite well with the leading test kits. And why? And I can tell you why we are doing it, because we have multiple antigens in our test kits, okay, multiple antigens for Borrelia, okay, and that's important because with the positive agreements and the negative agreements with all the other tests, we match the best with those tests that have multiple microbes, okay, like multiple Borrelia species in their test kit, like Eurimmune's test, and also the Seraspot, where they have multiple proteins from Borrelia, from multiple species of Borrelia there. So we match better with those positive agreements and negative agreements.
Then you have another question from Jack this time. You were criticized in your country for using combined IgG and IgM antibodies. What was the rationale for that investigation, and what was the outcome?
Yeah, so this, it's really interesting because we were criticized by three competing individuals that actually work for diagnostic, companies themselves. One of them was using the C6 peptide test kit that had the IgM and IgG together. Okay, and they just blatantly said that we are not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to combine the IgG and IgM parameters together. And yet we provided evidence that, yes, you can look at this test, look at this test, look at this test, but they didn't want us to, there was nothing that we could have done to convince them that you can use the IgG and IgM parameters specifically together, especially when you're trying to see them individually and then putting them together to see the increase in sensitivity and specificity as we did. So, I mean, I'm not sure what their motives were, but I know that they work, like I mentioned, with competing diagnostic companies. They have their own tests. Their testing scheme is testing one Borrelia species at a time, one antibody at a time. So I'm not sure if I could ever read their minds, but we can. You can put IgG and IgM together.
Okay,
I hope I answered the question.
Was your question answered, Jack? You need to unmute.
That's fine.
Yeah, okay. So then question from Kate Parker. Could this test be applicable for children who we think may have this, but no tick or EM was present, possibly inherited through the mother?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point is inheritance through mother is IgG, right? So, I mean, if you want to test the individual, then of course it's the IgG parameter that you're mostly interested in. But again, if you're following the NICE guidelines, you have to look at symptoms, right? So it all starts with symptoms, and then you follow the NICE 2-tier system, and we can fit in the first tier and get a better outcome for the second tier, of course. So yes, you can use these in children, of course.
Okay. Another question, how quickly does it take for your test to return results?
Well, so I'm the medical manufacturer. So I have to work with those ISO 15189 clinical labs, okay, that is accredited under a national authority. So it's their timeline on how they perform their test kits. And I say that our test can be performed in 4 hours. It can be, but depending on how long it takes for them to receive your sample, okay, enter into the system, perform the test, okay, and then send out the results. I know as fast, some labs are doing this as fast as 5 days. 5 days. Some are even quicker, 3 days, depending on which lab that you're using.
You're muted, Monica.
Unfortunately, there isn't a UK lab doing this in this country at the moment.
No.
So most patients are accessing tests in other European countries, like Germany, for instance, through AONM or through Napier's. But it's not at this moment, and it would be, be really great if you did tell us you had plans to team up with a UK lab.
We've always had plans to come up with a UK lab, always. But the point is COVID happened, and then Brexit first, then COVID, and now it's us thinking, okay, what's our growth plan now, okay, and UK is being serviced, like you said, through other labs. However, it would be very interesting to get a clinical lab there. But again, there's going to be kickback because the C6 peptide is what the NICE demands, guys. It's like, okay, guidelines are guidelines, but the C6 peptide is the thing. Yes, we have C6 somewhere in our portfolio, but we have other things too. Okay, so it's interesting to see how this will look once we do really get into a UK lab.
I just want to comment.
Yeah.
Just comment. The Irish have dropped the C6 peptide from the National Virus Laboratory because it's a useless test, it's worse than many other tests. So why not use the best test rather than the worst test? So Ireland is no longer using C6 peptide.
Oh, that's good. And interesting enough, Immunogenics has discontinued the C6 ELISA. So all those labs, and this is the whole point too with NICE guidelines, because the NICE guidelines have to readjust their guidelines because the C6 ELISA is discontinued. Okay, which means that it's going to force these clinical labs to think, how are we going to bring in the C6 if NICE guidelines are going to stay the same? How are we going to pick up, where are we going to get the C6 peptide? They're going to have to make their own. And if they make their own, they have to go through the regulatory demand that, the MHRA has on these laboratory developed tests. And
which would actually be very interesting, because when I spoke to somebody at the lab about why they didn't even offer as a private service, given that patients having to pay for these tests, the TICKPLEX in the UK, it was because we would have to validate it, and we don't have the budget for validating.
But the validation is already done. It's mandated, but now they're putting it. Okay, so in that context, what they say is that when this test kit goes to any lab that's ISO 15189 or accredited in their lab, yes, they have to do a validation study independently of us. So they have to validate it under their roof. But you saw the numbers of the sensitivity and specificity data. You only need 50 positive and 50 negatives as a minimum. And you can purchase these, but I'm not sure if you can purchase UK SARAs that are positive and negatives. Is there a biobank? I don't know. Maybe Jack knows better than I do, but I doubt that there's a biobank or a commercial company selling UK SARA that's positive, characterized, that's positive for Lyme disease, the negative for Lyme disease. I'm not sure. But it's
sorry.
No, I was saying that this validation study it's not exceptional. Like, it doesn't cost a lot. It's a matter of getting access to positive samples and negative samples and just running it. Like I said, we did it 5 days with Utenet medics in Finland. That was our validation study for them. Okay, and it took them, yes, they were collecting samples from febrile patients as well. So it took them 2 summers to collect that SARA right from the start. But I'm sure that these labs have characterized positive and negative samples. It's in their context of testing for Lyme disease. So,
okay. Kate has asked if we do a sort of one-page guide, could we make it available to everyone? Just to say that for everybody who's attended today, last year we set up a Mighty Networks community site for practitioners working in Lyme. And there are various sort of articles and things, this is for sharing information between practitioners. And if we do a guide sheet, I will put it there and make sure that everyone has an invitation. And if you think you might have missed it from your spam folder, you can get in touch with us to join. I think that's all we have time for at the moment. And I think some of the other questions that people have will probably be self-explanatory once they go back through your slide presentation.
and please feel free to email me too if you